Greetings all, D&Disability and Tunka here. We've spent the past several weeks discussing the differences in categories of player in our favorite hobbies, and, at least to some extent, what they mean for those of us with disabilities.
And if you haven't seen those videos, make sure you go back and you give them a watch. They are well worth your time.
And statistically, I've seen the analytics, you haven't seen those videos, so go back and rewatch them even if you have. Moving on, this video is the culmination of the topic. I've done things kind of in a reverse order this time. I've showed you the pop culture take first and my own personal take, but today we are going to look back and see the academic side, see the history of this debate, because it's a lot older than what you might think.
Dun, dun, dun.
There's a long history of player categorization in RPG study, and today's information is coming largely from Jennifer Cover's book, The Creation of Narrative in Tabletop Role-Playing Games. While this isn't a full review of her work, we will be taking some key points from it.
If you want a full review, drop a comment down below. If you don't, this book will get lost in the sands of time, and no one else is probably going to unearth it anytime soon.
Ain't that the truth? Well, at least with that preamble out of the way, let's get started. Gary Fine, in his book Shared Fantasy Role-Playing Games as Social Worlds, divides players into two main groups. Quoting directly, Fine, 1983, notes that D&D players can be divided into two groups, those who want to play the game and those who want to play it as a fantasy novel.
So what you're saying is those that just want to play and those that are pro railroading. I mean, I enjoy a good roller coaster as much as the next guy, but railroading is another story altogether.
Well, I don't think they mean railroad in a pejorative sense. They mean there's an explicit rather than implicit story. You go into Castle Strahd, as an example, find the Sun Sword, read his diary, and stab him in the face. This is the story and is a story-driven scenario, as opposed to the generation of the story through, say, randomized content as a purely reactionary world. This is similar to, in some ways, a sandbox, where players are given a series of things to do, but no real order or no clear story to make out of it. The story's told in post. And if you want to hear more about this, feel free, leave a comment. We can revisit this topic later. But really what we're seeing here is the root of the split between player types. Those who are here for narrative play, such as Tunka and myself, and those who are here for gameplay, such as the Dungeon Delver and many other OSRPG players.
So those that love cool stories and worlds and others that have random encounter tables. Gotcha. I mean, random encounters are cool and when done right can lead to great adventure hooks. But when just relying on random encounter tables, that kind of leaves the game dry, if you will.
It is a distinction of focus, not quality. However, it's far from the only model. Remember, this was created back in 1983 when TTRPGs were still rising from their infantile stage. Let's skip forward a few years. Let's specifically look at, and quoting from the text, Mary Kuhner came up with the term the threefold model to explain the model that emerged from the rec.games.frp advocacy forum in the mid-90s. And John Kim refers to this explanation, or refers to an explanation of this model on the darkshire.net website, which was last updated in 2008. It's been a little while. Kim's models, that is to say, the determinist, the simulationist, and the gamist, are the same foundational models many of us ascribe to today. Indeed, you've seen this and the reflections of them in my previous videos. And for more on this, see his threefold model FAQ, citation in the description. But in short, the dramatist is interested in using rules in every way possible rather than the story. Simulationists, stop me if you've heard this before, surprisingly use the reality of the fantasy world to dictate decisions. And finally, the gamists view their decisions as effectively meeting the challenges of the game. These would be puzzles, combat, roleplay, and they view these as just mini games in the larger game network.
But what about those that rely solely on random encounter table, like without a storyline to drive the game forward? I know sandbox settings rely on random encounters, but they're there to create story slash adventure hooks that drive the game forward. Whereas if you rely solely on random encounter tables, you have just that random encounters that lead nowhere.
Well, ultimately, I would say they're gamists. Their main way of generating content, using the word loosely, is to use game tools, i.e., those tables, to create worlds, adventures, etc. And it's not that the story isn't there, it's just told entirely in post. Let's think back to the player myth, right? Getting back to the world myth, the player myth, the hero myth. And the player myth is entirely retold in post. So, with that aside, now, at least, back in 2003 now, almost, over 20 years ago now, God, I'm old. Now, Wizards of the Coast, as some of you may know, threw their hat into the ring in 2003. They came out with their character actor, the storyteller, the thinker, the power gamer, as you'll see in this figure here. And a big thank you to Cover here for reporting on game designer Sean K. Reynolds, who reported on this model on his website back in 2003, because without her report, I probably never would have known this existed. And speaking of Reynolds and Wizards of the Coast, let's turn our attention to that figure again.
Now, there seems to be a happy medium for all types of players listed here at the crossroads, if you will, of the chart. I shall call this the sweet spot. And speaking of sweet spots, I would say it's important for the DM to know their players so that all types can play and enjoy together. So DMs and players alike, don't be afraid to open up a dialogue so that all can get their little itch scratched.
And also remember that no player is perfect. All of us have biases, right? Sometimes they shift depending on the day. Getting back into disability here, for those of us with disabilities, we may find ourselves heavily invested in role play one week and barely able to function enough to role play the next week. And we've only scratched the surface here. However, I do hope this was at least an interesting delve into some different viewpoints.
Well, hold your horses there, Mr. Academic Man. You never said why there's all these different views about player types and gameplay and blah, blah, blah. Can't we at least get a short answer?
Well, no, you can't, but I'll try. Cover puts it best, I think, so I'm going to once again return to the text. In addition to the various types of players, as I have noted, there are various ways to play a TRPG, from an individual session in a game store or a convention to ongoing home campaigns. For more on that, once again, see her book. But the issue that Cover brings up here is we have different ways of playing the game. And as long as there are different game modes, i.e. story games, war games, murder hobo-driven games, dungeon crawling games, there will always be a wide variety of players who tend to enjoy one game type over the others. And they will naturally bring those game preferences to the table. No matter how you slice it, the differences in player archetypes all come down to the game that player would rather be playing. Role players come from players that want narrative-driven games, such as Vampire the Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu, and those players will naturally, at least eventually, gravitate to those games. As where wargamers come from the gamist side of things. And really that can get into, D&D, but also chainmail, or more recently, Matthew Colville's Strongholds and Follower system and his kind of art natural language RPG system.
So again, I'm going to say, because this is important, that the DMs know their players so that all types can play and enjoy together. So DMs and players alike, once again, do not be afraid to have meetings with your DMs and other players and talk about what kind of games you like to play so that all can get their itch scratched. Speaking of itches scratched, be sure to scratch our itch. Critical hit that like and subscribe button. And as always, we'll see you in the comments below.
Sounds like we should probably do a video on session zeros at some point, but I'll leave that for another day. All right, all. I don't know what we'll get up to next. Maybe that session zero video. We'll see. Maybe I'll dive back into the medieval world. Take it easy.